Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jesse, Marketing Manager at Construx, and today's webinar is presented by Earl Beede. Earl is a Senior Fellow at Construx, where he designs and leads classes and provides consulting services on estimation, requirements, contract management, software methodologies, and more. Feel free to ask your questions in the chat box throughout the presentation on the right, and we should have time for a brief Q&A at the end with Earl. Earl, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Jesse. Well, I'm really glad to be here. Enjoy this opportunity to be with you and to talk about this interesting breakdown that we keep seeing in many of the Agile tools, the idea of epics, breaking down into features, breaking down stories and tasks. And the basic question I have is, what does that actually mean? How does that really look in practice? And so let's go ahead and get into it. I'll make myself kind of small here. This is me thinking aloud. And what am I thinking aloud about? What am I pondering, especially if we think about this epic feature story task breakdown? And one of the things that I realized when we're talking about an epic story feature task breakdown, it's actually a model, something that's trying to represent in an abstract way reality. And so what I'm thinking about here is I'm thinking about what are the models and what are the useful models to help us understand that and interpret that correctly. So we're going to look at a couple different models to help us sort of figure this out. And then we're going to dive in on the idea of a feature. And the reason I chose feature is that feature is sort of a transitional kind of thing. Stories and epics, most people sort of get to a certain degree, though, to be honest with you, a lot of people don't even understand those very well. And tasks, well, a little bit of trouble there too, but I think they get them better than this idea of feature in this breakdown. I mean, how does it actually work? So we're going to use feature as our keystone, if you will, or as our interpreter as we go through this. And so we'll take a look at a feature, sort of define it from what the models tell us a little bit about this. And we'll talk about writing a feature, right? The feature description, writing acceptance criteria. And I'll use that as a springboard to talk about writing epic and story features and acceptance criteria. And then we'll wrap it up. And with a few questions and a couple, hopefully, key takeaways you can have from this particular conversation. So what are these useful models that I like to talk about? What are these things? Models are an abstraction of reality, and they help us understand them. And when we talk about epic feature, story, tasks, sort of decomposition, there's a couple models out there, and they're sort of built into a lot of our Agile tools, the Azure DevOps, the Jira, and methodologies like SAFe. In fact, I'm gonna pick on SAFe a little bit here because not that their model's any better or worse than others, it's because at least it's articulated. They've tried to explain it a certain way, and we're gonna see if that's pretty useful. So I have the SAFe model up here. Let me just disappear for a second so you can see the entire attribution here. That yes, I stole this from the SAFe pages. In fact, you can see I hopefully ripped out some content from the SAFe pages here that sort of talk about this. And one of the things I ripped out is this quote that they have that essentially all models are wrong, but some are useful. And that's technically true. Models are wrong, not because they have incorrect information, but because they are by definition incomplete. That is, they are an abstraction. They only look at one part of the world. And the model I stole here, where this quote is right above, is their requirements model. And you can see, if you're familiar with this, you'll see things like over here that has the word epic over here, right? So you can see that there's an epic-y kind of thing. And there's our feature friend over here, right? So epic feature. And before that, you see capability. I'm not going to pay much attention to capability here because it's mostly just a SAFe thing. It's basically a collection of features, right? If you want to talk about it at a higher level, if you have multiple layers of SAFe, then capability comes in. But mostly it's epic to feature. And then over here is story, right? So we see story on here. And you don't see task on here anywhere. You don't see task anywhere because this is their requirements model. And so even SAFe recognizes that task probably isn't a requirement, though they're going to call it feature requirement, and they're calling epic requirements, capabilities, and stories all requirements on their requirements model. And so from this page and something that, or from the glossary, it says it did give us the definition of feature, and there was several lines, but I tore out from the page a little bit that made sense here. It says service that fulfills a stakeholder need. And I think this is important to understand, because when we start thinking about this epic service feature breakdown, we're sort of saying we've nailed feature as sort of a service kind of thing, right? Being our focus, okay? And so how that kind of works out. And then we look at acceptance criteria, because all of these down here have this idea of acceptance criteria on all the lists, right? Acceptance criteria. And so you look for a definition of acceptance criteria in SAFe, and there isn't really one. It says you have to have them, you have to gather them, but really getting good examples of what acceptance criteria are and what look, that's kind of open space right now. So not quite sure what's going on there. So we'll have to figure that a little bit out as we go forward as well. So this is their model, and it talks about, and if you look down here in this very small text, it says realized by, right, for all these things. So their decomposition is they use the term realized by. And that's a pretty nice little generic term. It's like, what does that mean? It's kind of ambiguous in a certain way. So we'll have to look at that a little bit more as well. But you know, this is a model and it is wrong. But the question I have is, what if it's not only wrong, but it's not that useful? Because maybe realized by is not a really good way to describe the relationship between an epic and a feature, or a feature and a story, or an epic and a story, because you can see the realized bar kind of goes that way too, right? So epics are only realized by features. Is that really helpful? Is that useful to us? Is that how it's supposed to work? And I think there is a potentially a better model out there. But before I go there, I want to share with you a potential urban legend. And I'm going to go into story mode here. Back in the early 2000s, when I was just starting out at Construx and working, Visual Studio was the rage in terms of DevOps kind of world. There wasn't DevOps yet, right? There's just, in fact, Azure DevOps hadn't been renamed into that yet. Visual Studio was the thing, but Agile was out there, and there were like roughly about 5,000 Agile approaches. I mean, that's an approximation there, of course, but it seemed like it, right? And certainly it's an exaggeration because new ones were invented every week. It seems like you turn around and 7 new people announced their new Agile methodologies in those early 2000s. And Visual Studio wanted to get on board with this. They wanted to have an Agile template. They wanted something that said, hey, here's how you do Agile here. But there were these multiple approaches and new ones coming along all the time. And if you've ever been on a committee that's made a template, that's tried to say, here's how we create a template, right? One of the things you say to yourself is like, we need to create a template that everyone will customize, that everyone will change for their own thing. And since we know we have multiple different kinds of Agile, how do we do that? Right? How do we create multiple different kinds of Agile? And so they said, oh, how do we do that? And they said, well, maybe we'll create something that they have to change. That's something that's so obviously wrong, they have to change. And what did they create? They created epic feature story task. They said, you know, if we create it this way, then everyone's going to change it because this is obviously wrong. Now, this story was told me by a person who said they knew the people involved. But, you know, that's why I say it's probably an urban legend, but it sounds true to me. It sounds like this is something a committee would do. We all believe that. And what we suffer from in reality is that no one actually customizes the template. It just sort of stays the way it is. So let's think about this. Essentially, all models are wrong, but something useful. Can we plus up that SAFe model a little bit? Can we make it a little bit better, a little more useful? And one of the things I think you need to do to actually understand requirements models and where epics and stories and feature and tasks live is to really talk about 2 separate domains of that problem. One domain is the problem space. That is, what problems are we trying to solve? This is the area of understanding the needs and wants of the people out there, not just about what they're asking for, but what their truly underlying need is that they're trying to do. A great story about that is I once went to the doctor asking to fix my ankle. We kept trying to do things to fix my ankle because that's where I was experiencing pain. It turned out I had a piece of disc in my back that had torn off and was pressing against the nerve that went to my ankle. My problem was torn disc. I thought my solution was something in my ankle. So really solving the problem involved my back, not the ankle. So really understanding the problem is one domain. Another domain is understanding the solution, how we're going to solve that problem. And these two areas are commonly known as the problem space and solution space. And so this is one good ad that we can stick on top of that requirements model from SAFe, is saying, you know what, some of these things are about understanding the problem, and some of these things are about understanding the solution. Maybe they're slightly different. And even on that one, we can start adding a couple more attributes to this. We can start talking about there might be things that address the whole problem or the whole solution. Like an architecture decision, like we're going to use a certain language, might address the entire solution. Or we're going to use a certain platform or technology, might address the entire solution. Or the entire problem might be we're going to do just claims management. That's all we're going to address, right? So there could be decisions or things that we address the entire thing or the whole thing. And that could be broken down into some sort of incremental or chunks of some kind, right? So these chunks or increments add up to the whole. It's like if we have a overall architecture, different subsystems could be increments of that. Or if we have an overall problem like claims adjustment, one workflow within that could be an increment of some kind. And then there are at the bottom some sort of bits down here, right? Tiny little bits of work, little decisions about the problem, like I like the color blue, or I see green better than red, right? And little bits of solutions like an algorithm or a particular table, right? So there's all these solutions, and this gives me that sort of old high to low level kind of thing, right? High level decisions or requirements are near the top. They talk about the whole problem or the whole solution, and low level decisions talk about one bit or something like that. So if we take the way most people approach the SAFe model, right? If we take those and using the SAFe model because at least it talks about something, if we take the way most people approach SAFe model, what we see is that they probably try to stick it all over here. That is, these epics are very solution-oriented epics. And so I put the scale model because I'm using the realize by technique here. And then those go down into some features, which are also still talking about the solution. And here's where a lot of people start getting confused, because it's like, well, I just wrote about the feature in the epic. Why am I writing about the feature in the solution again? I mean, the feature, do I need both of these? Can I get rid of just one of these things? And then again, I get confused again. My stories turn into my tasks because I've already written about the feature. The stories I'm writing turns into tasks. And then so what do I have tasks for? Because most of the things I have in my backlog now are task level kind of things. Build me an X, right? And so we've got all this. And notice I didn't have the realize by here because that wasn't on down here. I didn't have that on the SAFe model, so I couldn't give a little attribution there. But so this is how most people want to apply this thing. So let's see if we can plus this a little bit, because I think the real takeaway here is that we have nothing over in the problem space right now. Everything's in the solution space. Everything talks about what you're going to build, how you're going to solve some problem, but you don't understand the problem. And I think to really plus up the SAFe model a little bit is that we need to move a couple of these objects here. We need to say, you know what, maybe, and I think this is actually probably true, that these epics and stories belong over in the problem space, not in the solution space. I'm going to start pulling these apart by saying, let's have epics and stories talk about the problem and have features and tasks talk about the solution. And now I can have a much more healthy relationship between these things, because I can start talking about epics decomposing into, right? That these epics decompose into stories. There is a parent-child relationship here, that the stories add up to an epic. Epic being too big to fit into sprint, stories being things that actually fit into sprint. A parent-child, that is, if I change the epic, all the stories change. If I change a story, it may or may not change the epic. That if I prioritize an epic, I prioritize the stories underneath the epic, right? These break down, and if I talk about the problem, these break down relatively straightforward. I got lots of interesting ways to break this down. What does that mean toward my feature side, my solution side? It says I have this idea of respond in here in the middle. This idea of response says they're not a decomposition. You notice I even use a dotted line here in this little plus up from the SAFe model. I use this dotted line because what I'm suggesting here is that when someone talks about the problem, someone else says comes along with the solution. I'm having a pain in my ankle. Maybe we should do an MRI, right? You're telling me about a problem you're having. I'm coming up with a potential step of a solution that we can start investigating and understanding that problem better till we get more details on it. This call and response kind of thing. You tell me a problem, I come up and help come up with a solution and respond. And as I come up with a solution, that creates even more problems. Oh, since you want to do an MRI, I'm afraid of small places. Oh, so we'll have to give you some relaxation medicine to make sure that you can fit in that little tube of death that they call an MRI. Right? So we have this call and response thing going on, and I still think this realized over here makes sense, right? Features being something like we're going to add a new set of capabilities or tools, and here's all the things we need to do to build them. So I think realize still makes sense over there quite well. So we've got these two main things now. We've really plussed up this model to help us understand this a little bit better. Epics and stories have a good decompositional relationship. Features and tasks have a sort of decompositional relationship, but there's no decompositional relationship between epics and features or stories and tasks. They're responses to each other. They're the way of saying, oh, now I know that, I'm going to do this. And this really helps us understand then how that acceptance criteria in the SAFe model should really work as well, right? Because when we talk about acceptance criteria now, we're looking at what are the criteria if we're looking in the problem space, what's the criteria that we understand this problem so well that we know that when they give us a solution, that it's a reasonable solution, that doing an MRI is the right thing, that building that one table is the right thing. I have a set of criteria here to help me judge the solution. And if we're looking over the solution side, I'm actually looking for criteria to say, is this a decent design overall? Because the solution is basically design. Am I doing a decent design? Am I building a thing that's maintainable and sustainable over time that I can actually keep working on? So the criteria here sort of shifts between criteria about judging the solution and criteria about judging the design, right? So that, I think, is a little bit better of a model here that we can help plus up the SAFe model a little bit to help us understand this basic thing. We're not looking at a decomposition anymore from epic feature to story to task. What we're looking at is a decomposition from epics to stories, a potential decomposition from features to task, and a conversation, a collaboration, if you will, between the problem and the solution, between epics and features and stories and tasks. That's a conversation more than a decomposition. So let's take a little bit of a closer look at this idea of feature. And I put it in quotes because this seems to be the place where lots of problems start, especially people trying to use a model of the epic feature story task. They kind of get epic, but then what do I do with feature, especially with something like SAFe that says you need to have a little bit more information. So again, we're going to pick on SAFe a little bit, not because they're better or worse than Azure DevOps or Jira or whatever other tool that you see this epic feature story task decomposition in, but because at least they give us some printed information that we can rip out of their book and talk about. So what do they talk about when they talk about feature? Well, we still have that service over here that fulfills their needs or stakeholder needs. So that's certainly something we can talk about. And then they say, what is it that really makes a feature? Well, it's really, they say here it's defined by this features benefits matrix. So they know it's supposed to be solving something. It's supposed to be providing benefits to something. That's a clue here that maybe there is a separation between problem and solution because the features are actually supposed to be providing benefits somewhere, right? They're supposed to be solving something. Now, it's interesting here that they say our product managers and our product owners and other key stakeholders define features. Now, I'm going to let you hold on that idea a little bit here because I'm really not quite sure I agree with that, but I want you to just know that that's how they define it. And here's the benefit hypothesis, a measurable benefit, right? And this is tricky too. How do we get this measurable benefit? Again, trying to solve some problems. So that helps us agree that maybe features squarely in the solution area and our friend capability down here as well, probably in the solution area as well, because it's just the capability to select multiple features. And we still kind of have this gap over in acceptance criteria. And I got to tell you, I looked all over the SAFe site, and I know lots. I've taken a little bit of SAFe training, and I've talked to lots of them, and they definitely have a really clear definition up there. But I did go to the glossary, and it wasn't there until you hit the extended glossary button. When I hit the extended glossary button, this came up. So I tore it out there. Provide the information needed to ensure that a story, feature, or capability is implemented correctly and covers the relevant functionality and NFRs. Is that helpful to you? I hope so. It wasn't extremely helpful to me. It sort of says make sure things work right, and so it still sort of says what are you really? What do you look like? What is examples of this? And so we need to plus it up. But here it's kind of interesting, right? So I'm going to say NFRs here, and I'm going to actually tie this to the benefit hypothesis here in a little bit. So hang on to that for a moment. But what is this idea of feature? So here's the interesting, and I'm going back to this product managers, product owners, and other key stakeholders. These people coming together to drive this. And what does that really mean? Because we're kind of saying if the features are a solution to some problem, right? We kind of agree that they land completely here in the solution thing. Even Safe says they land here in the solution thing. Are we asking our product managers, our product owners, and stakeholders to be expert designers? Right? Now, I'm not sure about you, but that makes me a little bit nervous, and that makes a lot of other people nervous as well. Right? We see more and more people jumping on this bandwagon. This is a great book by Melissa Petrie about how people are getting to this build trap. They're just constantly building features that product managers are saying, here, build this feature. And they're realizing this is a strategy for frustration, that they're going to go completely nuts because your product managers, product owners, and key stakeholders are typically really crappy designers. They understand their problem well, but they don't understand design well. And so if we're looking at that enhanced model here, we can actually make something pretty clear here. We want our product managers, product owners, and stakeholders really need to be experts about the problem and opportunity that they're facing. They don't need to be experts in all the technology. It may not hurt, but they really need to be experts in what the community is facing, what problems they're trying to solve. And we need to have technology experts to creating the design, creating the features, and creating the tasks. Now, could I have a product manager who's expert in both? Sure, right? I'm not going to say that they have to live in one space or another, but I really need them. I really need the product managers and product owners and stakeholders to be experts in the problem, because I can't ask my technology people really to be experts in the problem unless it is a technology problem that they're currently facing, right? So I really want this to be true, but we got into this little problem here, right? One of the things is that humans, when they talk, our stakeholders and people talk to the project, they always talk in terms of features and solutions. They ask for a feature. They may call it an epic, they may call it a story, but they're really asking for the feature. Why don't we just give them for what they ask for? Why don't we just say, oh, you want the feature? I will build this feature for you. Why don't we do that? Well, because we see again, here's another book on the exact same subject, that we designed to solve the problems, not necessarily to provide the features they asked for. This is where Steve Jobs was coming from years ago when at Apple he said, we do not listen to our customers. What he really was saying was, we do not listen to the features they're asking for because they are crappy designers. They don't know our technology. They don't know the possibilities. They don't know all the trade-offs. But we do pay very close attention to their problem, right? So one of the things we're thinking about here is that we're enhancing that model with a story, feature, epic, task. With the story and epics, we really want our product managers to be experts in those, because that's how we solve the problems, and people then love their products. People sing the praise of products when you're solving real problems that they're having. Too often, and if many of you out there probably already know, that if you've worked on this long enough, you've delivered lots of features that no one's either ever used, or when they did use it, said, well, that really didn't solve my problem. Because most of our customers are not experts in the technology that we're building. So as we talk about this relationship between epic, features, stories, and tasks, it's really helpful to understand what is in that complete requirements, in those requirements models that we sort of saw from Safe, and is sort of included in the templates and tools like Azure DevOps and Jira. So I really have to do just a brief moment here on what does a complete requirement look like. And I suggest that a complete requirement has three main parts. It has an overall context, and it's probably one of the more important parts. And that's the whole description, not only just the specific of the problem, which we'll get in the description, but what's going on around the problem. What are they doing before this? What are they doing after this? Where are they? What's the world like? How skilled are they? How many of them are there? All this context, and in the Agile world, that context is carried by the product owner. Back in my old specification days, we would write very large specs with use cases and context diagrams and all sorts of other things to carry that context, narratives, scenarios, all kinds of things. You can still do that, and probably you should, but to simplify things, Agile says that's going to be a conversation that the product owner is going to carry forward. We're not going to pay too much attention to that because we're talking about epics and stories, and so we're looking at the Agile version. So we're going to sort of fade that out here and just sort of say, okay, that's part of it. But we're going to focus on the description and acceptance criteria. And these two parts are the parts that would be typically on a story card. Back in the day when we used physical cards before we started entering everything into screens. But the front of the card would have the description. And then you can see there's certain fields on the description, and in the back of the card would have some fields, but one of the key fields on the back of the card was the acceptance criteria. So let's take a look at those a little bit more. And again, here I'm going to be using my feature as sort of my way of going through this. And we're going to also talk about epics and stories. It's an interesting task. Tasks really don't have a ton of this, but we're going to talk about features and epics and stories as well, and see how features are different. So what is a feature description here? Well, the description statement, if you think about it in generic terms, the description statement captures the function or functional part. What do I mean by that? I mean, the description is going to say what actions are going to happen here. As a user, I can do these things, right? So those are actions to take. Or I need to know these things, information to remember. Or even, I think, rules to enforce. That is, as a business, we've decided not to rent cars to people under 25. Why? Well, we got lots of good reasons why, but that's just a rule we've come up with. We picked 25 as the cutoff line. That's a rule. Now your system must enforce that. So that's a function, something the system's going to have to respond to and build solutions for to say enforce this rule. And on the functional side, we're going to see that we're going to say we're going to enforce this rule. Here's how we're going to enforce this rule. We're going to have features to build to enforce this rule, or to take these actions, or to remember this information. We're going to create data stores for that. So description basically captures the function part. And how do we actually capture that? Well, there's lots of different ways to capture that. Generically, we have this one up here, my old friend, just say, what are the conditions, what conditions or what's happening, going on, any triggers kind of thing. And then you have the actor doing the action. When the countdown timer gets to 0, the system will blah, 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 only on Tuesdays. Now, the system will send an alert only on Tuesdays. So I got conditioned, actor, action, conditions. That's sort of the root of all of these things. You can take it up a notch perhaps and use the Gherkin format here. Right, Gherkin gives it a name, right, and which is a good add to this kind of thing. And yeah, otherwise you have to create your own tag. Given, which is a condition. When, another condition. Then here's the action and more conditions, right? So you got a similar pattern here. But what works really well here, and this is really kind of fascinating. This is the world where models reign, right? Activity models, use cases, sequence diagrams, state diagrams, information or class diagrams. These things are excellent at capturing these functions. They do a really good job. They capture a lot of functions in a little space. And so when I'm doing some sort of functional description thing, I prefer using models most of the time. They capture them just as well, and they communicate them, I think, more effectively than statements like the system will or as a actor I can kind of statements. And so you can use models here. And I encourage you, in fact, when I actually go in and watch a Scrum team executing sprint planning, if I don't see them up on a board or on a now virtual whiteboard drawing pictures, I kind of suspect they're not doing a very good job planning, because models are an excellent way to communicate our feature and our overall task plan. So if you actually wanted to physically write these things for the description part of the requirement, really the difference between the problem one when we look at our epics and stories and our features, and even to a certain degree our tasks if we're writing down there, is just a matter of perspective. Are you talking from the user or stakeholders or external perspective, or are you talking from the internal perspective of what we're actually building? From the external perspective, this is where the user story format was first born. People are trying to say, as a user, I can do these things. And it wasn't for example, on a toaster. It wasn't as a user, I can turn the knob to this level of brownness. But it would be more generic. It'd be, as a user, I can set the level of brownness I want. Whether we use a knob or a slider or AI or machine learning, that's the solutions idea to come up with, given the overall constraints that we've placed in the project, like budget and time. But I can set the brown level would be a use statement. The system shall provide a lever which allows the user to set the brown level. That would be on the solution side, right? And so we're just talking about the same kind of issue. We're just looking from two different perspectives. And so we write it slightly different. But again, you can see it's that call response format that I talked about, where one side talks about one thing and this says, oh, given that, we will do this. There's not a decomposition. It's almost at the same level. You notice I try to put these almost at the same level here because it's really close, right? They're almost talking about the same thing. What about acceptance criteria? What about that part? What makes a feature or design choice acceptable? How do we do that? And so what are acceptance criteria? Acceptance criteria basically captures how well the function must be formed to be, well, acceptable, right? And sort of I need to move my head here. These are basically the non-functionals for the old school folks, or what some people call the quality criteria. Right. So what acceptance criteria really are all about are saying, how do we know we've done this in an acceptable way? And the example I love to use is eating a piece of cake. How do you know that this cake is acceptable? Do you know it's acceptable because they took 22 minutes to cook it? Do you know the steps that they first beat eggs and then added flour? Right? That some sort of function, the steps or tasks you took to build it? No. You know it's acceptable because how it tastes, and its mouthfeel, and its presentation, and its calorie content. Things about it that make it acceptable are not the steps taken to build it, right? So these are, how do we know it's acceptable? We're looking at something that we're looking at as a scale of some kind, typically, and these are, because they have a scale, are almost, in fact, are always testable. Right, and we actually got a starter at this. There's a great list of these things called ISO 25010. I'm looking at the specification set right here. And in the specification set, we can see there's a bunch of categories. If you look at the overall list here, there's 31 subcategories here. So this is a pretty big darn list overall. But you could start saying, well, when we talk about features, right? If we're focusing on features first, when I'm looking at features, I think this subset of the overall 25010 are really pretty good for acceptance criteria for feature. How modular is this design? How reusable is design? How analyzable, modifiable, testable is the work that we're doing? The solution that we're building? Is it adaptable to new situations? Installability? And maybe you can up that security one up there too and put in that set. So feature and task, these are often the ones I look at, but you know what? We don't have to specify them on the features typically. Why? Because we typically capture these things as a coding or design standard. So we capture the acceptance criteria for our features and to a certain degree our tasks in some sort of standard typically, so we don't repeat it over and over and over again. Could we deviate it in some areas? Sure, and then we would specify it. But generally we can capture that in some standard. It's the other part of this set, the functional suitability, performance, capability, usability, all that kind of stuff. These are the ones that are great when you're specifying an epic or fit user story, right? Because basically an epic means it's too big, a user story that we couple of years means that it fits. And so these are ones I would put on scales and do a lot more work on. In fact, since we've been picking on our friends at SAFE a lot, I think they have a pretty good way of capturing these. I think they did a pretty good job describing how to capture these things. I think they actually took some of it from me, actually, so I'm obviously biased, but this is probably the state of the art of capturing these kind of non-functional acceptance criteria that you sort of say, okay, what's its name? And you say, okay, here it is. We're looking at this quality and its subquality. The quality and subquality, again, are coming from these kind of lists like functional suitability, dot appropriateness, might be quality, subquality here. And then what's its scale? It might be a Likert scale, 1 to 5. How suitable was it for you? Or it might be a revolutions per minute, or it might be number of transactions per second, right? You get a scale and the meter. That's sort of the idea of how you're going to, what kind of test you're going to use. And then on that scale, what are you willing to pay for? That's the target. Where is the fail point? There you can say, I'm going to give up. And I like to use a stretch. Where is it worth spending more and more time on? They like to put a baseline. There's lots of points you could put on here, but this is a reasonable set to start with, right? So I think they've done a relatively good job here at SAFE describing how to capture these non-functionals. What they didn't do is link them tightly to the acceptance criteria, because I don't think in that particular model they quite get what acceptance criteria really are. So I think this is going to give us a great clue about how we want to really go for this, how we're going to relate these together. So let's just sort of wrap this up here and put a bow on it and go on to some questions here. So my key questions I had walking into this thing, and I think these are things you should be asking yourself as you're thinking about epic feature, story, and task and how they relate to each other, is this really a useful decomposition in the first place? My argument is no, it's probably not. Epic to story is useful. Feature to task might be useful, but epic feature story task probably isn't a useful decomposition. It's a much better conversation. And if epics and stories, if you're buying my argument, are about user problems, if they're really, that's where they live, we should use those to talk about problems. And I believe strongly that that's what they were designed to do in the first place. And that feature tasks are about solutions design. Who should be talking about these things? Should our product owners and product managers be talking about features and tasks? We know they shouldn't be talking about tasks, right? I think we're pretty clear. Most people agree on that. But features, really? Are they really the feature expert? Or are they giving us features because they don't know how else to talk to us? Like I said, human beings talk about features. And do we need to give them homework to go understand and say, why is this feature making the use much better? I love that part, right? When someone says, Earl, we want this feature, I say, that's a great idea. Tell me a little bit about why that's going to make your life better, because that helps me understand the problem they're trying to solve when they're giving me this feature. And if your acceptance criteria is basically it works, do you have a better concept than that? Because that's not going to be helpful to you, because what you're going to be doing is just writing more features and more tasks disguised as an acceptance criteria. You're doing the little task decomposition inside the feature and you're getting frustrated. So your acceptance criteria should be more in the lines of how do we know we have an acceptable solution if we're looking at epics and stories, and your acceptance criteria should be a little more along the lines, how do we know we have an acceptable design, right? Not that we did it right. So some key takeaways that you could have from this little conversation today, some core thoughts, if you will. One is that this pattern that we see in our tools, this epic feature story task pattern, works best as a call response pattern between problem and solution. That this is a way that, let's just say, Agile wants the business and the developers to collaborate. And we've sort of have built in this conversation, epic to feature. Tell me about your problem, I'll tell you about the solution. Story to task. Tell me details, bits about your overall problem, and I'll figure out little things I can do to solve that bit, right? Epics decompose down into stories, features sort of get realized into tasks. I think that makes a lot of sense. And so we see this collaboration as a collaboration tool. This is much, much better and much, much more useful than seeing it, trying to see it as a decompositional pattern. And our best epic and story people, since we want to put that in the problem space for this conversation, are very close to whoever's consuming what you're building. Whether that consumer is a human being or another piece of software, or you're offering as a service and another business is using it, whoever's closer to that consumer are the best people to talk about our epics and stories, because they're talking about the problems we're trying to solve. Overall, then, our solution and for the solution side, the features and task people are close to the technology. We want these to be our technology experts. I want my architects to live over here. I want my chief designers to live over here. I want my UI designers to live over here, right? They're going to have to go understand the problem, but if they're doing UI design, I want the designer to live here. They are the people closest to the technology and know how to get this stuff to work. And if you're thinking about value here, if you're looking at the epic feature story task, ask, where does value really come from? It comes from actually solving people's problems. And so value comes from the epic user stories. Now I put it usually here because there are sometimes I've been seeing an epic. I really think it's probably a feature in disguise being misunderstood, but almost always the epic user stories are going to be where the value comes from. You're solving a real problem of mine. And once I talk about a problem, it's easy to break down that problem. And what really occurs is that I will build partial features to partially solve the problem. And then I'll build up that feature over time to solve more and more of that problem. And so value comes from epic stories, and those are the things that we can really, really break down. All right, so I'll call on Jesse here and see if we had any questions come into the queue. during the Q&A. And then if you haven't submitted your question yet, now's a good time to sort of pop that up there and see if you have an idea about or question you want to sort of give me. I think we got a few minutes for that to do that.
All right, Earl, I'll go ahead and ask you the first question that we have. Do tasks have descriptions and acceptance criteria?
Do tasks have a description and acceptance criteria? That's a great question. Typically not. They're going to be in a different family than this other stuff that we've been talking about. What they're going to be is more of a small deliverable that you're going to build. In the Agile world, when you're doing the sprint planning, the plan elements, often known as tasks, should be sort of deliverable based. What am I going to build when I'm done? Do they have a description? Yeah, maybe lightly, right? So I think you can squint your eyes and say they kind of do, but if you think more like little tiny deliverables, I think you're going to be better off than saying they're going to follow the same pattern. Probably why you didn't see them on the SAFe model, because if you look at that SAFe requirements model, you see that a same pattern repeating itself over and over again, and tasks aren't quite in that pattern.
Thanks, Earl. The next question, what if you are only given features? How do you get the epics or stories?
Right, this is a very common problem overall, that if you are given a feature, right? You're given a list of features. I'm working with a client right now that everything comes in as features from the top of the food chain, right? And no one can question these feature lists. So what do we do, right? Well, when you're given that situation, what you really want to focus on is start saying, okay, I get the feature. I understand the feature, and write it down, because they want you to accept that you know the feature. Then once you have the feature, then you go in and say, okay, now that I have this feature, let me understand why that feature is so powerful for you. Why are you choosing this feature? Let me understand what's going on when you use this feature. When do you not use this feature? And start exploring the problem. This is where the work becomes real. And this is why I get a lot of teams doing a backlog refinement, is they got a feature thrown in the backlog by some stakeholder, and they have to say, okay, for us to refine this, to get this into a ready state, we have to go understand the problems behind this. And now we give homework to the product owner to go out and do that work, to help fill in the epics and stories that are missing when we were given a feature on the product backlog. So when you're given a feature, see this as an opportunity to create true epics and true stories that belong in the problem space, and not just more feature detail in the solution space. Because typically, as we see in those books that I mentioned in the conversation here, when thinking aloud, doing that, allowing your customers to be your designers, typically is going to help you make relatively mediocre products.
All right, Earl, I think this is a pretty interesting question that someone asked. Can you talk about how to do the call and response in program increment planning?
Right, so the call and response in program increment planning. Whoops, I wanted to go to a full me. Way I like to do this call and response is that what the beauty is that you come up and say, okay, let's do okay. Let me back up for a second. First of all, let's assume that you've got some real epics on your backlog, right? So we got a couple epics like, I got this problem, I got this problem, I got this problem. What I would do is this is a great spot for, like in SAFe's big room planning or bring in architects. Let's go ahead and brainstorm features and start doing a feature benefit matrix, right? Say, okay, these features solve these problems that we saw in the epics. And so there's the call and response when you're using a matrix to call that out. If you start with most humans, if you start with features, then you assign homework to the product owner, say, go figure out this problem. And then once you go it, then you can build the feature benefit matrix again in the SAFe terms, right? You can say, okay, here's the features we have. Here's the problems we actually discovered. Ooh, right? These two features do good, but these three other features really are not solving the problem. In fact, we got a solution that we could do for half the cost and half the time that will actually solve your real problem. Are you interested, right? And having that conversation. So this is way you do it in incremental. You would say, okay, let's take a chunk of the backlog. Let's take the next 2 or 3 sprints worth of the backlog. And then we would say, okay, if it's already an epic, if it's truly epic problems, let's brainstorm some features and build a matrix to help get that flushed out. So I'm trying to get that backlog refined so I have a few sprints worth. Now, once I get that few sprints worth, I will start to maintain 2 or 3 sprints worth of stuff in the future. And so as an epic comes up, I'll brainstorm new features, or I'll say, oh, how can we enhance existing features? Now, in a sprint 0, one of the things I do want to do is I want to get the overall big picture. One of the things that I think is a misnomer and I want to go back to another picture here. We'll go back to this big picture here, right? Is that these 3 levels, the whole level, the increment level, and the bit level, this is where incrementalism really kicks in down here. I think you need to make some decisions up here, and to some level, some decisions up here up front. That is, you can't make and say, oh, we're not even sure what the whole problem is when we're starting. Let's just build stuff until see what interesting happens. You could do that, but for most of us, I think you're going to make these top level decisions really, really early. So when we think about doing the call and response and incremental stories, we're usually thinking about down here at the bottom. Okay, because down here at the bottom is we're going to see a lot more of the incremental, given that we have a framework for making those things on top. So just so I can draw on this one more time, I'll clean it up here, is that up here at the whole and increment, make these early. These should be made early. In fact, if they're not made early, I get my clients to do a thing I call backfill, is that we're going to make up what they should have been. We're going to say, we think this is the whole problem we're trying to solve. We think this is the big picture. And we're making that both on the problem space and the solution space. Here's the big problem we think we're solving. Here's the major architectural solutions that we're going to try to implement. Then as we get these bits, this is where sprint reviews come in. Bits say, oh, once we've done some work down, we've learned here, let's go reflect to make sure these are right. Right? And that's what the sprint review is now about, is checking out to make sure those are right. So how do we do this in an incremental fashion on incremental products? This call and response. We start up by trying to make some big overall, big epics. Here's where we might use the capability thing from SAFe or some other big collection of features. Get those sort of situated up front, big ideas. Start decomposing this, which will lead us to smaller features and tasks. Then incrementally cleave that out into 2 to 3 sprint buffer down here at the bottom.
All right, Earl, here's another question for you. What happens when a bug becomes bigger and seems more like a user story, or when the bug seems like a bigger problem than the product owner realized?
All right, so we're looking here and we're looking at a bug here, and we say the product owner doesn't recognize it as a big deal, or it seems to be more important than a story. Well, the rules, right, what little rules we have in Agile say that the product owner can decide is it more important to fix it or not. Now, this is where the problem benefit matrix really becomes important, or stating your acceptance criteria in non-functional terms. Because once I have my acceptance criteria in non-functional terms, what that means is that I can now measure and say, hey, because of this bug, we're no longer acceptable. That's the real question. Is the bug making it so you're not really solving people's problems anymore? Because once you stop solving their problems, it's game over. They're going to hate it. No matter how many features you deliver, if you're not actually solving any real problems, forget it. I don't like it. I'm not going to invest my time and energy to change just because you've made some cool features, right? I'm only going to invest the time and energy to change because you're solving real problems for me. Okay? And so what we need to do is express that bug and say, okay, here's the problems that are now impacted by this bug and how we're no longer acceptable based upon the acceptance criteria of those epics and stories. Yeah. That'll be my short answer. You can always contract us for lots of mentoring help.
That's true, Earl. And I'll go ahead and ask you the next question, though. What is the biggest mistake when creating acceptance criteria?
Yeah, the biggest mistake, that's a good question. One of the biggest mistakes in creating acceptance criteria is to pretend that acceptance criteria means decomposition of a function or feature into the steps you're going to take to build it. For example, one of the things I see over and over again is that if the story or the epic is, as a toast lover, I want to make toast. They say the acceptance criteria is I want to get bread, insert bread, heat bread, and remove bread. What I just did there is said make toast in more words. I decomposed it into its steps, the steps of making toast. I haven't said anything what it means to be acceptable in making toast. What it means to be acceptable to make toast is that the toast doesn't take more than 4 or 5 minutes to toast, right? If it takes 2 hours to toast, that's not acceptable. That the bread doesn't burn, right? If the toast ends up burning all the time, that's not acceptable. That it actually turns some level of brown over a certain degree of distance on certain types of bread. That's what it means to be acceptable. That's the kind of, it doesn't burn down my house, doesn't consume all the power available to my circuit. Those what it means to be acceptable, not the steps of actually making bread. And so the biggest mistake I see over and over again in the acceptance criteria is they just decompose it into smaller stories, call it acceptance criteria, when really they've never talked about what makes it acceptable at that particular level the story's at.
Okay, Earl, one other question. If the relationship between epics and stories is parent-child, what is the relationship between epic and feature? And by the way, I'm posting these into the chat if you need to refer back to them, Earl, to see the question.
Oh, I should like open up my chat then, huh? So the relationship between epic and feature, what is its relationship? It's really, again, this idea of call or response. It says, here is a problem, give me a solution. So we have in one of my medical device companies, we have tools that create two different kinds of link. One is a parent-child link, one is an association link. And what you would have between this feature and this epic is what they call an association link. This feature is trying to solve this particular kind of problem. Okay. If you are doing something different, right? If you're trying to say, oh, these are the children of this thing, then we use a parent link. But what we're saying is that this feature is trying to solve this problem. So we create an association link between the two. Now, the problem here is that one problem could have parts of multiple features, not even entire whole features, but parts of multiple features need to be invoked together to solve that problem. And one feature can actually be used to solve many problems. That's why we have between these two a many-to-many. Parent-child is nice. Parent-child is one-to-many. One parent, many children. For every child, there's one and only one parent. That's the nature of a parent-child relationship. But between epic and feature is a many-to-many problem. There could be many features and many parts of features to help solve this problem. For example, if my problem is I need to create a Word document. I need to write a document for an essay. I need to write an essay and print it. Well, I need lots of features to do that. I need to be able to type. I need spell checking. I need lots of features to be able to write that essay well, right, in an acceptable way. So all these features help me do this, but all those features also help a mail merge, right? So it's a many-to-many. It's association between these two that you can capture in an association link, but think of it more as, hey, I've got this problem, and hey, I've got the solution for this problem. Let's make sure that as I build the solution, it actually creates a solution that's acceptable to you based upon your acceptance criteria.
All right, Earl, I think you may have covered this question a little bit already, but when should features be created?
I like them. So again, if we think about that big picture I had, let's see if I can find my big picture again. Let's put it up here one more time. In that big picture background, I think features generally can be at certain levels. I mean, your big features should be created very early. Most people go into the project already knowing what their big features are going to be. What they don't really often know are what their epics or solutions really are. They don't really understand the problem very well yet, and so they need to spend some time doing that. I think big features should be created early. You can create smaller features as you go incrementally as people learn about their problem more. And you'll say, because one of the things that I always see is that after we start building, people actually start learning about their problem better than they ever learned before. Because hopefully if you're doing a good job, you're asking a lot of key questions like, what do you do before that? Who else has this problem? When have you seen this problem manifest itself in other situations? And they start going, oh, and oh, and oh. I had one client recently who said, we built this feature because they said we wanted this feature. We built this feature, released this feature. And when we released this feature, because we wanted to make it as robust as possible, we ended up breaking a workflow that they never told us about. Now, why did they never tell us? Because no one bothered to ask. No one bothered to explore the problem. They just wanted to build features. And so they broke something that they were already using. And then they were frustrated. They say, what you build broke what we were doing. And they go, we didn't know you were doing that. You never asked us for it to do that because you never gave us that feature. So one of the things we discover, and this is the old, I don't know what I want until I see it kind of problem, is that as we build it, they will think of new problems, which means we'll have to build new features. So we'll see incremental features, but I want my major features sort of defined up front. I want them, the big ones up there. I also want my big epics up front too, if possible. But we're going to see lots of features happening as we go forward.
Earl, this is a longer question, so I'm posting it in the chat as well for you. Their question, I see some teams forcing the use of the OKR model in the product backlog. The breakdown looks like objective, key result, deliverable tasks. I'm curious to know your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so my coworker Eric Simmons was at Intel when Andy Grove invented OKRs, and it's kind of a breaking of it. I mean, I can see what they're trying to do there. They basically, their epics have become feature solution levels. They never pulled their epics out of solution. They wanted something in the problem side. And so they created the objective there on the problem side, which really should be your top level epic. So I would recast that objective, that OKR, as a top level epic, pull my epics into the problem side, get them out of the solution side. And use that tool, which I think is exactly what that tool is invented to do, right? To be that problem side statement. Get that tool over there and then let that be there rather than trying to do OKRs. OKRs were designed for organizational forcing collaboration. The idea of an OKR was to create something that took several teams to build, right? That you couldn't build it by yourself, because if you can build it by yourself, it's just a goal. An OKR should say, hey, here's how we as an organization need to combine the talents of multiple teams together to build something interesting. And so if you're going to look at this model, I try to take that out, pull my epics over to the problem side, and use my epics instead.
All right, Earl, I think we'll go ahead and end it there for the day. Thank you for the presentation and the Q&A, and thank you to all of our attendees for joining and contributing with those great questions. We look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks again, Earl.
There you go. Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.